Welcome everyone. My name is Amy Johnson Crow, and I'm so glad that you could join us today for this video called Laying the Groundwork for Your Ancestors' Story. Start with all the censuses. Census records are so much fun to work with. They contain so much information and they're so easy to get into. Sometimes I think it's almost too easy because it makes us skip around a little bit. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Why you really need to look at all of the censuses. So let's go ahead and get started. With all of the different types of records that we have to look at, whether it's census records, vital records, military records, what is it about census records that makes it such a perfect vehicle for laying the foundation for some really great research and some really great discoveries? What is it about the census? Well, the census was taken every 10 years. And since it's taken very regularly, it gives us a snapshot of our ancestors' lives at different points in their lives. So you can find your ancestor in the census when they're a child still living at home. You can see them after they've gotten married and they've started to have children. You can see them in their later years when they're empty nesters. So being able to get that regular snapshot of our ancestors' lives, it's a really great way to get a more full picture of our ancestors and really give us some ideas of what they might have been like, what their lives were like, what they were going through, as well as giving us some great ideas for things that we should be researching later. The other great thing about the census, besides the fact that it's been taken every 10 years, is how long it's been taken. The first U.S. census was taken in 1790. The most recent census was taken in 2010, but the most recent census that's available for us as genealogists to look at is the 1940 census, and that became available just last April. So it's still a really new collection that all of us are, still digging through and finding some really great discoveries. So from 1790 to 1940, we have a regular opportunity to, again, take that snapshot of our ancestors' lives. So what is it about laying a foundation with the census? The recent ones, beginning in 1880 and all the way through the census of 1940, give us relationships, which make it easy to understand the household. You don't have to guess about, well, is that their child? Is it some other relative? Is it a niece? Is it a nephew? Is it a grandchild? Is it some unrelated person living in the house? So these recent ones, beginning in 1880, since they list relationships, it allows us to really understand the household. Now, the census questions varied from year to year, but beginning in 1850, we start to see a lot more information besides just names. We start to see birthplaces, marital status, occupation. If your ancestor came from another country, there could be information about immigration and naturalization. Other censuses have questions about military service, or if they had some sort of infirmity, especially the 1880 census has some great questions about that. Property values on some of the censuses. So although we think of the census as having names and relationships, think about the census in a broader context and think about all of the different types of information that you can find from census to census. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the U.S. Census has changed over the years. This is a snapshot of the census from 1790. And as you can see, it just lists the name of the head of the household. And then there are just numbers afterwards. These numbers relate to, first, the number of free white males who were 16 and over. Then we have, in the next column, free white males who were under the age of 16. Then we have the number of females in the household, all other free persons, and the number of slaves. So this first census of 1790 is giving us very basic, very bare bones information. And you might wonder, well, why is it so sort of sparse in information? Stop and think for a moment what the official purpose of the U.S. Census is. The official purpose of the census is to apportion the representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. So how many congressmen you have depends upon the population of your state. And that's why the census officially is taken every 10 years to do that apportionment to Congress. So these early ones, that's all they were focused on. But as the census progressed, they saw, hey, this is a good way that we can learn about the people who live in the United States, not just counting them. We can actually learn some things about them. So we go from this very bare bones census in 1790 to having a much more robust census in 1940, where, you know, this is the width of the page. We have street addresses, we have the names of everyone in the household, we have relationships, gender, marital status, ages, birthplace, where they were living in 1935, questions about occupation and things like that, salary, income, things like that, things that they never dreamed about asking back in 1790, but they have it here in 1940. So you do have this progression from the very early censuses and asking more and more questions as time goes along. So let's take a look at a real-life example of laying a foundation with the census. There were two people that I found in Perry County, Ohio. Found them in the cemetery, George and Susan Skinner, husband and wife. George, born in 1841, died in 1920. Susan, born in 1850, and died in 1929. As I said, I found them in Perry County, Ohio. So a good place to start looking for them in the census would be the 1920 census. The 1930 census and 1940 census obviously aren't going to do us any good since George died in 1920 and Susan died in 29. So let's start with that 1920 census. So if I do the search on archives.com, which the full census is available to archives.com members, and I go to the search page, the way that I can narrow down to a specific census, I can choose over here, get the mouse to work, there we go. And I can scroll down and choose census records. So that will narrow my search just to the census. I can fill in what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for George Skinner in Ohio, and I'm going to narrow it down to Perry County. He's buried there, so that seems to be a logical place to start looking for him in the census. And then I can narrow down the census year to 1920, which that's the one that I wanted to start with. And just click on search, and I get my results. And the first one I have is a George Skinner with an estimated birth year of 1842. Now remember, the George that I was looking at, according to his tombstone, it said that he was born in 1841. Well, the 1920 census was taken in January, so it's likely that George didn't have his birthday by the time that they had taken the census. And you do want to think about, you don't necessarily know who gave the information, so ages could be off by a year or two. So this one looks pretty good. I'm going to take a look at this first George Skinner. And when I click through, I can see this information that has been abstracted from the census, information about gender, his birth location, where his parents were born. But I can take a look down here at the household and I see his spouse, Susan, and that's exactly who I expected. And her age is also what I expected. This looks to be the George and Susan I was looking for. But I don't want to stop at just what's been abstracted from the census. I want to look at the census itself. So I can come over here and click to view the image. And here we have the 1920 census for George and Susan Skinner. And look who else we have. We have a daughter named Nora B., another daughter named Lizzie, and we have their ages. We see both of them are single. And then I can use the little thumbnail over here and I can scroll over to see the rest of the page. This is just a portion of it. I can scroll over and find that all four of them are reporting that they were born in Ohio and that their parents were born in Ohio. I can scroll over a little bit more and I can see that George is listed as not having an occupation. He was 78 years old at the time, so it's not too surprising that he didn't have an occupation. So if we go back to what we started with, this is the information that we had when we started, just very basic information about George and Susan. And look what that one census gave us. It gave us birthplaces for both George and Susan, and also added two daughters, Nora B. and Lizzie. Now, what some people are really tempted to do, and this is so easy to do because you get excited, you find something, and the thing about genealogy is you find one answer, you find one person, and what's the first question you ask? Well, who are their parents? So it would be very tempting to take this information and try to jump back to, say, the 1850 census or the 1860 census and try to find George living with his parents. And you can certainly do that, but the problem is that there's so much other information you can get from those other censuses in between. So instead of just finding this one census and skipping back several and trying to pick up another generation, take your time and move back census by census. So we took a look at 1920. What about 1910? Because if we want a solid foundation, just think about a house. Walls aren't going to stand very long if there are gaping holes in the foundation. And that's why we want to look for all of the censuses. Plus, each census asks different questions. And here's why you don't want to be complacent, because you never know exactly what will be in the census until you actually look at it. So don't be complacent, don't skip ahead. Look at all of the censuses. So instead of going back and trying to find George with his parents, I just moved back to 1910. And see, we still have Susan and Nora B. So we haven't added anybody, but look at the information we've picked up. This column here indicates that this was George and Susan's first marriage, the M1. The next column, 42, that's how many years they'd been married. The next two columns for Susan, the 9 and the 8, indicates that she'd had 9 children, 8 of whom were still living. Again, this is in 1910. And I can scroll over and see the rest of the census. And George does have an occupation in this census. He's a laborer at odd jobs. So now look what we've added with the 1910 census. We have a new occupation for George. We have information about the marriage and information about Susan, that by 1910 she had 9 children, 8 of whom were living. So if that was 1910, what about 1900? Finding the family in 1900. Whoa! look, we have more people. We have a son named John. We have a daughter, Belnora. And that age, that looks remarkably like Nora B that we'd seen before. We have a daughter named Claire, a daughter named Elsa, and the daughter Lizzie that we'd seen before. And looking up here, Susan is still reporting 9 children born to her, 8 of whom were still living. So now we know that that child died before 1900. And we've picked up that George was a farm laborer. So now what do we have? We've picked up his occupation. We now have that by 1900, Susan had 9 children, 8 of whom were living. And we added 3 children and picked up a name for Nora B. Could she also be Belnora? The name is certainly similar and the birth date is the same. So that's definitely something we want to take a look at, keep an eye out for. Now, if that was 1900, normally you'd say, hey, okay, let's go back to 1890. Unfortunately, most of the 1890 census was destroyed by fire. Very, very sad day in American genealogy. So instead of looking at the 1890 census, we actually have to go back to 1880. And I put this in 2 parts so I could zoom in a little bit better. But here we have George and Susan. He's a day laborer. But look at the children we've added. We've added Mary and Martha. We now have a middle name for John instead of just John H. Now he's John Henry. We've added Sarah. We've added James W. And our Nora B. or Belnora, or in this case, Laura Bell. Also look over here. While George and Susan are both reporting that they were born in Ohio, like we'd seen in all the other censuses, George, it's now reported that his parents were born in Virginia. So that's a discrepancy with what we've seen in all of the other censuses. So it's something that we're going to want to take a look out for when we're looking at other records. Were his parents born in Ohio or were they born in Virginia? And so that's what we can note as we kind of add on to this timeline. Add an occupation. We add this note that George's parents are now reported as born in Virginia. We picked up for Susan that she couldn't write. And we've also added 4 children to the family, as well as some alternate names for 2 of them. And look at who all we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 children. So we have all 9 children that we expected to find. Now, one of these children has died by 1900. And John, Nora, Claire, Elsa, and Lizzie are on the 1900 census. So the one who died had to have been Mary, Martha, Sarah, or James. So we have a death date narrowed down for one of them. So we can start to think about some other records that we should be looking for. Are there death records available for Perry County, Ohio in this time period? Are there obituaries that we should be looking for? Things like that. Then going back to the 1870 census, and notice we only have George and Susan, or she's listed here, Susanna. Just those 2. Which leads us to the question, where was Mary in 1870? The 1880 census said that she was born about 1868. But again, we don't know who gave that information, so we don't know how accurate it is. So, was she actually 10 years old and not 12 years old, like it was reported in the 1880 census? Something, again, we need to take a look at because we didn't find her in 1870. Is her age off, or is she, staying with Grandma and Grandpa for a while? We don't know, but it's a question that we need to answer. It's something that we need to take a look for. As I said a moment ago, you can never assume what you will find in the census until you actually look at it. Don't assume that, oh, I already know the family, I've been researching them for a long time, I don't need to look at the census. Because if you do that, you might miss the one census where the mother-in-law is living with them. Well, if Barbara Miller is Joseph Erlinger's mother-in-law, chances are his wife's maiden name then is Miller. Handy piece of information to have. Sometimes census takers didn't follow the directions. I love this census out of Philadelphia, where instead of listing just the month and the year of birth like he was supposed to in this census, he listed the entire birth date. Love this census. I wish I had people living in Philadelphia during this time period. Some things that I'd like to point out. The 1940 census, again, the most recent census that's available for us to use. You can search it for free at archives.com. You don't need to be an archives.com member to search it or to view any of the 1940 census images. Just simply go to archives.com/1940 census and start your search of that great census. That's a fun one. Another really cool thing, I like to take the census and put it into context and use the census to put my ancestors into context. And two great features that we have here on the site, one of them is called the American Family Through Time, and you can get to it at this URL, archives.com/1940-census-facts. And you see what looks like a little game board, and you can click on any of the census years. So I could click here on 1880, and it will bring up a great little snapshot of the entire 1880 census. So I can get a feel for occupation and education. You know, if my ancestors were living in an urban setting, how common was that in 1880? Say the family you're looking at had 8 children. Well, that's larger than average in 1880. And you can click here to read all of the questions from not only this particular census, but every census. And that is a great thing to be able to go through and see what questions were asked in what census years. Some links here so you can stay connected with archives.com. Keep following us on the blog, like us on Facebook, and for those of you in the Twitter sphere, you can follow us at archives.com. So three wonderful ways that we can keep you up to date. For those of you who are watching live, I will be popping over into the chat room momentarily to answer a few questions that you might have. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube later on after this presentation, glad you stopped by. Again, this is Amy Crow. I'm so glad that you stopped in. And until next time, happy researching.